Thank you very much. So what I'll do in these few minutes is just to find some of the messages that came out of these 2 days and add a couple of points that perhaps will introduce a bit the discussion. So what have we learned from the recent global developments in trade and trade policy? I think we can take three different views. So if we take a policy view, what we saw is that there are contrasting trends in trade policy and international cooperation. We talked a lot about decoupling, deglobalization, but in fact, we see also elements for further cooperation. Then we can take a macro view. And what we discussed today, it's different forms of separation. But there can be different stages of separation, different forms of separations, and these are very distinct effects on the offenders, on the targets, and on bystanders. I will say something more later on that. And finally, the micro view, we had quite a few papers that reminded us of how firms are at the core of what we are trying to describe, and not only firms, but firm-to-firm network that are increasingly dense. And so the point here, we saw it from different angles, is that deglobalizing is very hard to achieve precisely because these networks are very complex to capture, and sometimes the policy measures are very imperfect and rough forms of trying to shape them. But also when it happens, it's very costly. So let me just get quickly to these 3 points. The first one on contradictory policies. So as I said, it's true that we saw a lot of harmful measures, which is the top line here, with an incredible acceleration since the COVID. But so the number of policies that are friendly, that open more trade, increased over the same time. And also those had an acceleration in recent years. To be noted that a lot of these policies take the form of subsidies. So there is a lot of industrial policy in this new era. The second point is that where is this industrial policy concentrated? One area is policies for climate change. Other areas are for jobs, for security. But so if we look at policies for climate change, we can track what's happening in this acceleration, and we can ask ourselves if they target trade intentionally or if trade is a bystander. And so the picture is that while over a long period of time, and still now for the majority of the policies, trade is really a bystander, in recent years, we see more of an intention to target trade with in the motivation of these new policies. Here in the chart, I'm showing what's happening in the G20 countries. We see that increasingly in the motivation of these policies, there is a direct intent to affect the competitiveness of the country. So climate change and policies for climate change are used also to shape the competitiveness of the countries. And increasingly, and that's are the green bars, there is a concern of leakage. So in a context that becomes more conflictual. And that's probably a point that I would like to get back in the debate. And a lot of these policies do not take the form of measures that change the relative price of goods, but again of subsidies, as we see more in general. So I was saying that at the same time, while we see a lot of the policies that have intentionally or unintentionally this distortive effect, we also see a lot of dynamism. So many more deep trade agreements kept to be signed. The services economy has liberalized since the global crisis, and these charts show this. And so the picture is really mixed. Now, coming to the second point, there are different stages of separation. So we saw Brexit, which Aditya defined as a marriage breakdown that goes into a friendly relationship. Being a European, I would say it's not that friendly, but it's true that it gives different opportunities and challenges when there was a deep trade a very deep trade agreement before, and the ex post relationship is still very deep. And of course, the relationship, the depth of the relationship within the couple, it's important, but it's also important the depth of the relationship of the separating couple with others. We then had the US-China war, which is the move from a non-discriminatory to a discriminatory relationship. And again, we saw yesterday that it can deliver unexpected results. And importantly, for the bystanders, the shape of the demand and the supply of the country, the ability of the bystander economy to reallocate resources, it's important. And then, of course, we heard today and yesterday about sanctions, which is an attempt at collective punishment. And so there we have issues of effectiveness versus collateral damage and roundabout trade, as we heard today. So these are all very different issues which we need to learn to start separating. The third point is that we heard about Malaysia's plan to make a dent in the digital economy. And the digital economy is really interesting because it's a very complex industry. It's not anymore the global value chains where there is a lead firm and suppliers that do exactly what the lead firm do. All these boxes are different industries that interact in very complex way with one another. I call it a massive modularity, but it's a highly decentralized system where there is not an obvious leader and where the relationships are very strategic. So when you try to influence this system, it's really hard to say what it's happening. And so what I think happens, and I'm going to circle back to the first slide of why we have contradictory policies, is that the same forces that push for decoupling also push for cooperation. And that's why we see that both policies that accommodate trade and policies that antagonize trade are on the rise. And so understanding really these tensions within each of the dimensions is really important. To stay in 7 minutes, I'm not going to get into that, but it's important to look into each of these dimensions. And then I wanted just to conclude, going back to the firm level, just because when one looks at firm relationships, it seems the firms are very aware of these complexities and of the importance of this accommodation. Here we just see that firms that are more connected internationally, they do better than firms that are less connected internationally, both in the volume of sales and in having a lower volatility of their sales. And interestingly, they do comparatively better since the pandemics or since the, let's say, the Trump wars than before. So let me conclude it here for now. I just threw some ideas for discussion. Thanks.
Thank you again, Daria. And I'm really happy to have three illustrious people here. And I presume you've been introduced already? You have, sir. So let's begin this conversation. You know, we are very knowledgeable and perceptive perspectives from three different angles. But I'll begin with Datuseri Wong. And, you know, if you could help us understand, you know, when I look at the trade data, I look at the most important imports of Malaysia and their integrated circuits. You look at the most important exports and their integrated circuits. So the question I had for you is, what do Malaysian firms do? What are the tasks? What are the components that they produce? And how has their role in these global value chains evolved over time? And I would also like you to talk a little bit about the distinction between the foreign invested firms and domestic firms. So just that's my first part question, which is more about history and evolution and where we are today.
Oh, okay. Sorry, on the left. Oh, sorry. Thank you very much. First of all, before I start, what I like to do is give a quick introduction about Malaysia Semiconductor Industry Association. We got it started in January 2021. Now it's about 2 years, 4 months. And we have 218 members from 10 states in Malaysia, out of the 13 states. And we also have the headquarters coming from about 17 countries around the world. So we have Europe, Asia, as well as Canada and USA. So we have a combination of members. Now, if you look back into the how semiconductor started in 1972 is when it started, and the companies just were using packaging assembly. That's how it all started, low cost, because at that time, US, Europe were looking for a low-cost country. That's how Malaysia started. And then we added on assembly and test, and then we added on EMS, development of the local offset, and so on and so on. And today, we are here with even more in terms of medical devices now, what Zafar was saying, Minister was saying. And we have very complex development all the way from just not just manufacturing, but into GBS, global supply chain management, and many types of leadership functions in Malaysia. So we have reached that stage today, very complex. So if you look back in 1972 till now, in 1972, we had about 230 million export. Today, we have 593 million export. So that is a CAGR of about 16%, and it is doubling every 5 years. So that's where we are. And in the process, as the companies, the FDIs especially, because our strategy at that time was FDIs. So Malaysian companies were involved from the point of, in the beginning, was semi-automation, then become full automation, then they went to precision machining, and getting more and more involved in the complex manufacturing, okay? Because our technology was something like 100 micron, and today we are talking about 7 nanometers or less. And the manufacturing continue to go up the technology chain into the state-of-the-art technology. We are still doing all that in Malaysia, very complex. So the local companies try to keep up with all this technology, and they are very strong in automation. From, as I said just now, semi-automation is mainly just the handling system to full automation, and now they design equipment, they design the whole manufacturing process automation. And WD, Western Digital, has a lights out factory in Malaysia, okay? Last year, they were one of the 6 in the world, and today I understand there are more than 10 of this around the world. So we have one in Malaysia like this. And a lot of the capability in the factory were also helped by our local Malaysian companies in developing systems, software, and automation. Although it's not a full automation, but parts of the automation, they are involved in helping WD to be lights out. So we have come a long way, and Malaysian companies have also improved. But however, we still have a long way to go, all right? So now, if you look at it globally, it took more than 50 years to reach semiconductor sales or 550 billion global semiconductor sales. And it's projected that it is going to be 1 trillion by 2030, which is about 7 years from now. Malaysia is at 593 billion ringgit, about 600 billion ringgit. If you're going to keep up with this trend, then we should be at 1.2 trillion ringgit. So the question is Malaysia up to it? Just now we heard the minister says that we are going to, invest, go up the value chain and so on. So yes, we are at a point whereby we should be focusing not just on FDI, but also on the development of local Malaysian companies. And where are they going? So we are very strong already in automation. We are also quite strong in OSAT, which is the outsourced assembly test manufacturing by Malaysian companies. But we are still at a point whereby IC design still at the early stage for Malaysian companies. For the multinational, they're quite advanced. And also the fab, we don't have. So to grow to 1.2 trillion sales of semiconductor by 2030, it is projected that there will be something like 100 fabs need to be built over the 7-8 years. So let's say the forecast is not quite right. We say 50. 50 fabs is still a lot of investment, okay? High-end fabs cost more than 10 billion. The low-end fabs probably 4 to 5 billion US dollars. So Malaysia need to position itself to capture all these opportunities for growth. And we need the local participation, not just the FDIs. So now is a point, I think we have the opportunity to look at how we can further develop the Malaysian companies in IC design, in system design, in embedded system design, as well as attracting a fab. So last time we had a discussion at the ASEAN forum. We said that we need to attract at least one fab out of that 50.
Dr. Sri Wong, I would request all of you not to underestimate. I mean, you cannot underestimate my ignorance. For example, I don't know what fabs are.
Oh, just now the minister said that the supply chain of semiconductor is you start with design, then you do wafer fabrication. In the wafer fabrication, we call them a fab plant. Okay, you make wafers around 200 mm or 300 mm wafers. And then after that, you go to assembly, and then you do tests, and then you end up with embedded system, what we call it, PCBA, printed circuit board, modules, and then at the end, it goes into a product like iPhone and a computer and so on.
I should have had a tutorial on this.
So in terms of value, the IC design and the fabrication is the highest value. Assembly and test has the lowest value.
And those are the things that the Malaysian firms...
We are very good at the assembly and test. But when I say low value, it's very relative. It doesn't mean that it is low. It is still very complex. The technology is still very advanced. And there are a lot of things Malaysia still don't have relative, let's say, to Taiwan, Korea, Japan, and the US. So there are still a lot of things that we need to catch up, even in assembly tests. However, there are opportunities for Malaysian companies to now look at the other two areas, which is the fabrication as well as IC design, due to the opportunity that is created by this US-China trade war and the geopolitical tensions.
So that was my next question to you. How are these recent developments affecting, performance, opportunities, constraints? And I mean, do you see this as, Malaysia primarily benefiting from the relocation of production? Or do you see these, for example, export restrictions that the United States is imposing, which are also, my semiconductor should not ultimately end up, say, in China or something like that. So how do you see the impact on, you see this as, let me say, would it be myopic to see this as a positive development, or are there long-term opportunities here?
It's both opportunities and long-term opportunities, both, I would say. The situation now has created a different scenario for Malaysia. With the US-China trade war, everybody is looking for solutions. And everybody just woke up and realized, especially during the pandemic, Malaysia is one of the critical hubs in the world. We are the top 10 in the world because 7% of the global trade flows through Malaysia, and about 13% of the assembly test packaging capacity are in Malaysia. And if you want to keep up at that 13% level, we have to double our capability over the next 7 years. So during that time, during the COVID time, Malaysia was blamed, that's how it became famous, for not able to ship products, especially for automotive, because a lot of factories around the world have to shut down their factories because the automotive chips come from Malaysia, a high percentage. We have 6 major companies producing automotive chips in the country. And because of that, they blame Malaysia. But then by October, November of 2021, we have already recovered. And we were running 100% of a factory at that time. So theoretically, we are shipping everything already. And on top of that, the factories were expanding in terms of capacity. But even then, people still blame Malaysia, even though we have already done our best, because they have forgotten they are also creating problems, like Taiwan and so on. They also have their fair share of shutdown of factories. So then everybody woke up and felt that, and realized that semiconductor being the foundation of all the things that are happening around us in terms of applications of electronics, digital, what have you, it is the new oil. Semiconductor is new oil. And everyone wants to have a fair share. That's why they talk about onshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring, whatever, in order to have resiliency in the country. And every country is looking for opportunity. Yesterday, I spoke to the ambassador of India. He says India is putting 2 billion. So Vietnam, Thailand, you just name them, Indonesia, China, they are all trying to figure out how to stay ahead in terms of competition. Malaysia has to do the same. Opportunity is now. So factories in China is looking for a solution. They have to move out because of the various conditions that US has placed on the trade war. US also is looking for a solution because they want to ship to China, but then China is also preventing them. So they also have to look for a solution. So it's Taiwan. Taiwan say, I'm caught in the middle. I cannot be just in Taiwan. I got to find a solution. So where would they look at? So we are hoping with the help of the Malaysian government and everybody else, they look at Malaysia. But Malaysia have challenges. That's now you ask me about challenges. We have challenges. We have challenges in ease of doing business. We can be better. We have done a lot already based on the World Bank ranking before. We have done a lot of improvement, still not good enough. We have a war on talent. Now it's a war of technology. You have to keep up and compete. And therefore, all of us have to compete for this global competition in order to win more. And we got to win that one fabrication factory, FDI I call it, because it's so expensive, Malaysia cannot afford to do it, to bring into Malaysia because they are going to other countries, which Malaysia is not in the radar right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very thoughtful and excellent setting of the stage. And you mentioned that we need to do more on policy. So I'll turn now to Datuk Seri Sham. And, Malaysia has always been proactive, whether it is in terms of its own reforms or whether it's engagement in international relations, international negotiations. I'd like you to tell us a little bit about how has policy thinking on trade in goods and perhaps also in services, how has that evolved, and what do you see as the role of trade for development, and what do you see as your key domestic reform and international negotiating strategies, especially in this current environment?
Thank you very much. That's a very good question, actually, and take a long time to explain, but it's very complicated. Okay, firstly, in the past, we have about 14 FTAs that we've done for Malaysia, be it bilateral, or regional, or even multilateral. So in the past, it's always been about how we want to be competitive. And we've always looked at market access, on how we can develop our industries and that industry become strong enough for them to be able to compete openly. Then we open that sector, we liberalize it. And market access has always been the key part in any of the FTA negotiations. But later on, we see other things coming in, like e-commerce and government procurement. But after the pandemic, things have changed actually. IPEF is a game changer. We do not talk about market access anymore. It's about the more important priority things that we need to solve via an FTA type of an agreement or framework. So IPEF is not an FTA, the traditional FTA, but it's a different way of an economic framework. And that economic framework is to solve those problems that we are talking about.
I'll just tell everybody that the IPF, because I'm learning all these things myself, is the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework.
That's right. So there are about 12, 14 countries in IPEF. And China is not there. US is taking the lead. Japan is also very actively in IPEF. And we've had discussions among some of the IPEF members, mostly with the US and Japan. And they're looking at ways on how to solve issues of global supply chain, global value chains, and other non-market access related kind of discussions. So IPEF is different from the traditional FTAs that we've been talking about. So that's a game changer. But for Malaysia, our major trading partners are mostly in this region, the ASEAN region. So in ASEAN, we are not talking about that. Not all ASEAN members are in IPEF. So what's happening now after COVID-19 and the disruptions that's happening. So this has also been a game changer or an eye-opener for government. And in the past, we talked about supply chain. It's about how production and distribution, this with production and distribution of product from A to Z. That is government's problem. We've always looked at how do we fix problems in the supply chain. There are gaps, so we have policy intervention to fix the supply chain. And that's how we develop our industries as well. In the past, we developed industries from ground up. We brought in anchor companies, and from those anchor companies, we developed SMEs, tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. So we've been creating that supply chain. And later on now, as we become more advanced developing country, so that industry that we have developed in the past needs to grow and create their own value chain. So they need to go up. So this value chain is more led by the private sector, like industries like Dr. Sri Wong's semiconductor industry. So government's level now at supply chain has actually stopped. So it's now private sector now driving the initiative to discuss about how do they grow their value chain. But after COVID-19, things have changed. So we in government now are trying to figure out also how do we now use policy intervention now to help semiconductor that's happening now. So number one, we spoke about the US-China trade war. Taiwan, for instance. So when we develop our industries from 1960s today, we have actually identified about 27 sectors in the manufacturing sector. But today, we think that the 27 sector that we have developed is just too many because we need to find niches, we need to find industries that will be able to carry us out of the middle income trap. So the new industrial plan, the new industrial master plan today, it's a risk that we are going to take where we will be a bit more radical. For the 27 sectors, government cannot carry all 27 sectors anymore. We've built the supply chain, we built the 27 sectors. Now we need them to be independent and they need to move up the value chain. So the new industrial master plan is not going to be like the traditional industrial plan that we've had. So we are going to set some mission, some challenges for them so that then they can meet and develop their own value chain. So that's one game changer that we are currently doing in terms of policy intervention by government. Now, in the semiconductor industry, that's one sector that to us is very, very important because we have the complete ecosystem now to become one of the major semiconductor producer. Dr. Sri Wong mentioned that we need to have one anchor semiconductor company, then the tier 1, tier 2 SMEs will come in and support that sector. Now, we look at Taiwan and the US-China trade war. To us, for Taiwan, that's an opportunity. would companies now put all their money in Taiwan with what's happening? So Malaysia is a good place now for those major Taiwan companies to look at and create their new hubs or major manufacturing facility here in Malaysia. So semiconductor industry, looking at geopolitical changes now, so now we are identifying that semiconductor is one of those from the 27 sectors that we have to now pick and put our focus on. So that's part of the new industry master plan. And your question about government trade negotiations, trade policies that's happening in the FTA. So these are also changing with times. But currently, number one, I hope that after the PRN or Pilihan Raya Negeri, government will be able to put all our focus on now to move the economy. That's one of my biggest hope, because it's so fragmented in terms of getting people together, and now we have to think as fast as the private sector. So that's number one. Number two, once we have the new industry plan, which we hope to launch in September, we need to move very fast, because other countries like Vietnam, Laos, for instance, and even Indonesia, they are all fighting for the same products in that basket. So we have to move very fast. So we hope that the new industrial master plan that we'll be launching in September will help us now become the first mover advantage in this region. Now, the next one is about ASEAN in 2025. I know I'm jumping a little bit, but in ASEAN 2025 is when Malaysia will be hosting ASEAN. Now, this, with what's happening in the disruption in the global scene now, we speak or we talk about deepening our integration and also bring the collaboration among ASEAN closer together, because we see that companies who have very good ecosystem, they have all the integrated companies all located in one area, they survive better during the pandemic. So in ASEAN, in 2025, MITI is now in discussion about bringing this issue of trade and global value chain insecurity and ensuring that we work together among ASEAN first, so that we create an ecosystem among ASEAN, so that we can create a more secure ecosystem among ASEAN members, so that whenever there's another pandemic or another global calamity that happens, we are ready. Currently, we are not ready. What happened during the pandemic was an eye-opener for us. We have no plans. We did not have a crisis management plan that is super proof or foolproof for us to endure another global issue in the future. So that's why government now is trying to learn and doing a lot of scenario planning, so that we can equip ourselves and be ready for the future. And this scenario planning are the things that we are now picking up more the important points, so that we can embed them in some of the future FTAs that we need to put as a chapter in the future FTAs. Not only market access, not only services, not only on agriculture, not only on manufacturing goods, not on e-commerce, but things that can get us ready for future pandemics. Thank you.
If I can just ask you, just to very briefly respond to this question. You rightly said the private sector is going to lead. And this whole question of the greater sophistication that you aspire to, what concrete policies would facilitate? When you say the new industrial plan and the Honorable Minister referred to it, what, if you give us an example, because this is an army of academics, and they need something tangible to sink their teeth into. They're used to thinking of tariffs, subsidies. What is it, the concrete measures that you think would take Malaysia and help the private sector? Is it getting out of the way, as in some countries, like India and Indonesia, there are too many restrictions which make the business environment not friendly? I think Malaysia is already different. So in terms of proactive policies, if you could give some concrete examples of what you think would work.
I mentioned about being competitive, about, you rightly mentioned about tariff, market access, those were traditional. Now, Minister mentioned about prosperity, economic prosperity. So we have to now move away from market access, being competitive now, towards more making the economy more prosper. And prosperity with this Madani concept is also something that we're thinking about and how we can embed that into our new policies. So MITI has now embarked on a radical approach towards moving away from where we were to more radical economic approaches. For example, as I mentioned earlier, in the past, we've always created or developed sectors. Now we're moving away from that. We are moving away from that because we are now telling the private sector that government have done so much in developing that sector. And we have helped in our interventions to make sure that the supply chains issues are resolved. However, in the future, we cannot rely a lot more on government subsidies, government grants, because we have issues on that. We are not as financially prosperous as we were in the past. So we have less financial support for the private sector. But we are looking at ways on how we can facilitate the FDIs that are coming in for them now to also embark on that radicalism that government will be introducing in terms of policies. So for instance, I mentioned about developing sectors. Now we are not going to be developing sectors. We are working with the World Bank now on introducing mission-based industrial policy. So the UK has already embarked on that, and we're looking very closely on that mission-based industrial policy development. So that is something that we hope to introduce in the new industrial policy, which is radical. And we are confident that this approach is going to take us out from this middle income track and move us up from where we are today into the higher global value chain. And we hope that this new industrial master plan will put us or leapfrog the economy and bring us out from that middle income track to where we should be today in a more developed economy status soon, which I hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You know, I saved Dr. Ong for the last because I had the privilege of hearing him when we launched the World Development Report 2 years ago, and brilliantly insightful. And now I'm also happy that he was a deputy minister and now he's an academic. So he's seen life from both sides now. So, and he doesn't need to be diplomatic, so he can tell us you know, how has he seen the evolution of you know, both trade and trade policy, and both from the private sector and the government perspective over the last few years. And also, if you can tell us, what do you see as the biggest strengths and the biggest challenges of the private sector in Malaysia, as well as the biggest strengths and the biggest challenges of policy making in Malaysia?
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for the many challenging questions. Glad to be here wearing an academic hat, but with also some experience in MITI. When I was the deputy minister there, Dato' Hisham was the Secretary General, and I'm really glad to see him back at his comfort zone, his base, to be able to drive industry there. Maybe just give me a little bit of leeway to elaborate on one particular policy that Dato' Hisham knows well, which was launched when I was at the ministry, which answers that particular question of concrete policy, which is the Industry Forward or Industry 4.0 policy. And that policy was specifically aimed at the SME community in Malaysia, many of whom were not doing what they needed to do in terms of automation, in terms of going up the value chain from industry 1.5 to 2. Most of them are stuck probably between 1 and 2. And what MITI did during the time was we gave the opportunity for any SME that was interested to undergo a readiness assessment. Basically, get in experts who have been trained in different Industry 4.0 related assessment procedures to give a report for these SMEs in terms of different different quadrants on how they measure up to Industry 4.0 standards. So I think there were about 9 quadrants that were identified, and that report was given to the SMEs. The following step was, after you've done your readiness assessment, you know your limitations and your shortcomings better. You know areas where you can improve more. MITI then gave a matching grant, a readiness assessment, sorry, a business intervention grant, where you could get up to 500,000 ringgit matching grant to identify certain projects that you can embark on to start your Industry 4.0 journey, right? So it was tough going at first. Many of the SMEs did not want to embark on this exercise because they perhaps had not had that strong of a history working closely together with the government on these kinds of policies. But later on, I discovered after a lot of pushing and promotion, especially during the pandemic, that was when they realized this is something that was necessary. They got on board, they got their readiness assessment, and many of them had access to this business intervention. So from an academic perspective, it will be very interesting for academics, including perhaps researchers from the World Bank, to take a look at the profile of these companies, probably sign an NDA of some sort, and then evaluate how many of them went through the readiness assessment, and then how many of them went through the business intervention to get the grants through, and how many of them were successful in doing this kind of business intervention improvements. So that's to answer one question. The question on evolving approaches to trade and trade policy. I think this is one challenge that all ministries face in not just in Malaysia but across the world, which is when the trade negotiators speak to one another, they speak in a certain lingo. Dato' Hisham knows this very well. And it's very technical lingo, but it's important because that's how things like rules of origin are crafted and whatnot. But when these policies have to be communicated to the private sector, that's when the problem comes in, because the private sector does not know how to read free trade agreement text. Maybe a lot of, I think even a lot of civil servants may have trouble accessing those kinds of texts. So I think the challenge then for governments, including in Malaysia, would be to work together with the private sector, work together, for example, a concrete example would be work together with people who provide logistics services, DHL, FedEx and all that, because they know the kind of custom charges that they have to charge for their customers. But if let's say there are changes in the tariff structure, there are changes in the rules of origin, there are changes in the FTA in terms of ratification and implementation, then they would be able to work together with MITI, with government, and communicate these kinds of policy changes to the private sector. Just a little bit more to add. We talk about CPTPP, for example. I'm glad that it's been ratified, and that there's been no policy reversal on this particular policy. Dato' Hisham and I fought hard when we were in the ministry to push for the ratification. And now that it's been ratified, I think the challenge would be not just to communicate the benefits of CPTPP to the industry, but also work together with the different countries on how to implement and deepen and concretize the different aspects of this supposedly higher quality FTA, and it is. So for example, on issues of data localization, CPTPP says that without any exceptions, unless there are carve-outs, there should not be data localization restrictions, right? To what extent has that been implemented in Malaysia, in other countries? I think this is one way in which the trade policy landscape can be better filtered down to the ground. Last question on the strengths and benefits of, I think, the private sector in Malaysia.
I said strengths and weaknesses.
Sorry, strengths and weaknesses. I think we have a very strong FDI community. They have been in Malaysia for a long time. They have been invested in Malaysia and Malaysian talent for a long time. And they do have a pretty good ecosystem vis-a-vis the local suppliers, which has resulted in a lot of companies growing and even being listed on the Malaysian Stock Exchange, including in the E&E sector. Dato' Wong will know a lot of Penang players have been listed and are doing very well. Those are the strengths. I think the weakness would be many of the SMEs who are involved in manufacturing are not able to scale up. they are not able to, in fact, get away from their dependence on, let's say, being contract manufacturers for some of the larger FDIs in the country. Right? So for the academics here who may be interested, Dyson, for example, they do a lot of contract manufacturing in Malaysia and in the Philippines. There are a number of Malaysian companies that have been listed as a result of their relationship with Dyson. But the kind of contract manufacturing that they do, many of them have not been able to go out from the lower value chain. And one of them even got into trouble because of some alleged labor practices, labor practice abuses. Right? So that's one of the key challenges, from the perspective of SMEs who are not able to move out on their own. There are some good examples, but not enough.
And I also had a question for you about policy making. What do you think is the strength and weakness?
Yeah, the strength of Malaysian policy making is that it's very consistent. There are a lot of plans and policies that have been published by the different ministries. And of course, the Industrial Master Plan has a long history. Hopefully, the newest one, the new Industrial Master Plan, will not be as voluminous as the ones before. Just to give you an indication, the third Industrial Master Plan was over 900 pages, and it covered like 37 sectors, right? So it had plans for every single sector. And I think that kind of approach is probably a little bit outdated. Going to this mission-focused approach would be much more, I think, innovative, more creative. And then the policy sort of like parameters that you want to push and identify, it goes into different objectives that you want to reach. So for example, if let's say we want to achieve certain levels in terms of sustainable manufacturing, that should cut across all sectors, whether it's E&E, whether it's furniture, whether it's food manufacturing. So those kinds of principles and policies should be implemented across the board, just like what we were trying to do with the Industry 4.0 policy. Right? And this is, I think, something that I would say is currently something that we can improve on, having those kinds of policies that are aligned across industries and also across ministries, which I think MITI, under the leadership of Dato' Hisham and also Tengku Zafrul, is doing very hard on. Probably the most optimistic area I'm hoping for is in the area of policy coordination on the electric vehicle sector, especially with regards to the manufacturing of different components and also services related to EV, not just asking the EV players to come and do CKD manufacturing, but of those cars, but the components and the services involved.
I think that's a very thoughtful response, because especially I'm happy that you mentioned services, because as the Honorable Minister said, it's not what you make, but it's what you do. The distinction between manufacturing and services becoming blurred. And I think one question, so there are two quick questions. One, as economists, we are, and especially trade economists, we spend a huge amount of our energy on tariffs and border taxes. But I think some of the most interesting examples of success in this region are of proactive industrial policies. Now, I think the very nice suggestion from Dr. Ong is that there was an attempt to equip small and medium enterprises to engage in this new industrial 4.0 revolution. And we are one area where Amit Khandelwal was here. He was a Yale professor. One very interesting piece of work he did was to try and evaluate the impact of assistance that is given to firms, what works and what does not. He worked with Egyptian carpets and Pakistani soccer balls, and that work. Now, if there were an opportunity for academics here to work, or for the bank to work closely with the government in doing precisely that kind of evaluation, which would provide real-time feedback. And if we could have the kind of firm level data which is matched with, for example, trade data. Now, for example, in some countries, we have been able to do remarkably rigorous analytical work including in Vietnam. We have a researcher from there. Indonesia, surprisingly, very detailed data. So that would make it possible to do the kind of credible evaluation which would help you discover which types of treatment, for example, management training has in some research shown to have a big impact on firm performance. So I think the question is, how far do you see, and this is a question for all of you, because it will require collaboration between the government, the private sector, and academics. So we have all three of you here. So question one, in evaluating industrial policy and the proactive policies that you're contemplating, how far is it that you can work with and you would invite academics and perhaps institutions like the bank to work with you by sharing data, by defining the question, and by actually implementing a treatment in a way that is conducive to evaluation? That's one big question. The second question is the services sector. Now, Malaysia has benefited enormously from openness to trade and investment in goods, but like many countries in this region, the services sector remains relatively protected. You know, you spoke about the gold standard CPTPP agreement, where Malaysia's commitment was to open its services sector, but with the provision that Malaysia's best interest would be kept in mind, which is a recipe for a high degree of discretion. So one is an area of the persistence of restrictions, which is services. Again, you know, understanding when you talk about empowering small and medium enterprises, you know, access to better services, better finance, better transport, better communication could be critical. So there, the reform agenda seems, at least to an outsider, still incomplete. Then there is the services innovation or the industrial innovation agenda, where you're talking about proactive support. So how do you see, first of all, the scope for collaboration? And if you see political constraints in designing and sharing and working on reform, then how should they be addressed? So I'll start with you quickly. And again, I want brief answers because then we can turn to the academics. So first, if I can ask you, Datuk Seri Esham, to begin and tell us what you think.
On the first question, with regards to the collaboration between academic, government, as well as industry, I think that's already ongoing. Even with the new industrial master plan, we've been working together very closely with the World Bank and also with the industries. I think that collaboration is very, very important to us, especially on what you mentioned about data, because without data, we cannot plan, and we cannot plan and we cannot manage. So that is something ongoing, and that's something that we really encourage, because government resources are quite scarce in terms of experts that we have. Now, with all this integrity issue, governance, a lot of government servants are being moved around or rotated. So we in MITF also lost a lot of good talents and experts in certain fields where they have to be rotated and move around. So that's a challenge for us, and developing officers from to become SMEs or subject matter experts is a challenge now. In the past, it was okay, but now with this rotation, is created a big challenge for the civil service. But with the assistance from the academia and of course from the bank, definitely this will be very good input and support the future government policy making. On the services, for Malaysia, I think the CPTPP is the most advanced FTAs in terms of how we are opening up on the services sector. Now, when we open up the services sector, it's not the government who decide. We need to consult the specific services sector. For instance, the legal, the construction, perhaps and other accountants, for instance. So we need to always engage with them, and we always ask them, "Are you ready to open up on it?" They will. Well, some of them are very professional, and they say, "Yes, we are ready." So we can open up. So that's how we liberalize them, and we write them. We write it in the trade agreements. But some of the services sector are always saying that we are not ready to open up, because we are not sure where our future lies, and we're not really ready to be opening ourselves up to be competitive. So that's one challenge that we are always facing when we deal or when we discuss with our stakeholders in terms of opening up the services sector. So, but we know for a fact that the contribution of the services sector has been growing in the past, and it has surpassed the manufacturing sector, and we know it's for great importance for us. And even in the CPTP negotiation, in the past, traditionally, we've always gone on negative list approach, but this is the first agreement that we have gone on a positive list approach, where we write down all the sectors whom we can open and liberalize. And those sectors that we cannot open and liberalize yet, these are the sectors whom I think we would welcome inputs from the academia as well as from the bank on how we can help these certain services sector that are not open yet, and for them to understand, yes, it is important for them to open themselves up, maybe progressively over a certain period of time so that they can be ready to face the challenges or competition that they will be facing for us to liberalize. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a forthright and thoughtful response. Dr. Sri Wong, I wanted to hear from you about, how can we work with you and the academic community to help you understand the challenges, and also how help us to also define how the government support would be most effective, both in terms of where it's the government making your life easier by not imposing restrictions or regulation, and where they can provide more proactive support.
Okay, we have been working on this government, private, public, private, academia approach, I don't know, 20, 30 years already.
Has it been a success?
I don't think we have achieved what we want to achieve. It's an ongoing process. And if you ask the industry, they think that they can get a lot more, from the academia. I mean, take an example. Malaysia wants to be a country of innovation. So we have studied many models. All of us, past 30 years have looked at Silicon Valley, look at E3, look at many other countries, how they have changed, how they have evolved. But Malaysia just couldn't execute. We know the models, right? I mean, Silicon Valley, they say the universities are around it, Stanford University, they come out with all the researchers and all the ideas come out of the university, and then they spin off and so on. So my question is, we know, not that we don't know, but we couldn't execute. So how many companies that came out from the university? So just now, the Ong says that EV, we want to focus on services and components. Hey, EV, the idea of EV is what? How many years? 10 years old? So where is Malaysia in the EV development? If you say you want to play with the academia, with the public and the private sector. So we have been focusing in Malaysia on FDIs. Countries like Taiwan, Japan, Korea have been focusing on the domestic development. I think now is the time for us with this current situation, the scenario that we are in. It's the best time now to focus on our development of our Malaysian companies. How can we put more emphasis to help our Malaysian companies to innovate and grow, become global champions? FDIs, we are good. Double down on it is okay. Continue. We need the technology. We still have a lot to learn from them. But how can we turn this around? So I throw this question to the academia. How can we do it for our Malaysian companies? Last month I took 12 companies to see Bursa, to see the chairman of Bursa, that these people are ready for listing. We have so many companies who are ready for listing. But, they need a lot of funding, they need strategies, they need many other things, to help these companies to develop and really see the big picture and plan ahead. So we need to develop leaders. So in the past, our focus has been technical, trying to work on the low-cost labor. I am an advocate of developing global leaders. If I have more global leaders, I will have the ability to lead the company to a global level. If I have regional or local leaders, they can't get up there. So we need leaders like this. So, for example, Asian School of Business. Where do all these graduates go? How many of them work in Malaysia?
We can ask
All
them
right.
now, actually.
So, you know,
where
why
do you
can't
go?
why can't they lead some of the companies here?
You know, I should tell you that a lot of them go abroad. The
Yes,
number of smart Malaysians in the rest of the world is
they all
probably-
go abroad because they always think that the grass is greener on the other side. The other side pay more and more opportunities. I tell you, we have as good opportunities in Malaysia. I can tell you, it is there. We have so many global leaders in Malaysia doing global jobs.
I agree. And I think, you know,
But
this-
there are a lot of people don't know.
Yeah.
I'm trying to highlight these leaders because they are based in Malaysia and running global operations, running profit and loss, and not just, they are running businesses as well, not just the operations. We have many like this. So how do we develop global leaders and work with the universities to help these companies to take them up?
I think you're absolutely right, because, you know, just creating skills without opportunities is like pushing on a string. You create unemployed graduates who then either emigrate or protest. But trying to forge new ground without skills is like pulling
Yes.
on a dead.
So,
So how do you create that virtuous, mutually supporting
yeah.
relationship where skill producing institutions can respond and new opportunities can be created? Now, you wanted, so one person I see as a leader is Dr. Hong, and you have straddled these worlds. So how can we, you know, so, and it's not an accident that we had a leader in the government, a leader in the private sector, and a potential leader who straddles these worlds. How can, you know, we change this dynamic in a way that we create a more symbiotic, mutually supporting relationship? And how can institutions like the bank, the Asian School of Business, other academic institutions, how can we harness their energy and insight and place it at your disposal?
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to answer those questions by giving a few examples. And then after I give the examples, I would give some thoughts on why it is difficult to, that there are some challenges in getting to the kind of collaborations that you were talking about. You mentioned some examples of possible government and academia collaboration in terms of research, and I'll give you three that relates to MITI. The first area that I'll be very interested in, I'm sure that MITI would like to have those kinds of findings as well, is to have access to firm level data where you can measure the extra value added in terms of exports. This is for both FDI as well as DDI, domestic and foreign companies. And the reason why this is important is to be able to link it, this variable to other explanatory variables that you're interested in. So for example, the percentage of foreign labor that are employed. One of the constant demands by the private sector here in Malaysia, both domestic and local, is that they need they need foreign labor in order to enhance their operations. To what extent does this foreign labor actually contribute to additional value added or not, as the case may be? And there may be other explanatory variables that you'll be interested in. For example, the capital investment per employee. This data is actually collected by MIDA, the Investment Promotion Agency. But again, this is how do you say? It's private data, so you may have to sign an NDA in order to get access to the data. So if let's say that kind of analysis can be done, then you'll be able to communicate this kind of information to the larger public that says, oh, this FDI actually doesn't really bring in that many benefits to Malaysia. It only benefits the foreign companies. But if you say can show that the export value added is actually much higher among these companies compared to others, then you can make that justification. That would be one example. Second example would be in the area of how government grants may be able to assist domestic firms. And this is a question that is, studied all over in terms of the effectiveness of industrial policy, right? Whether it's Korea, Japan, China now, and of course, countries like Malaysia and Singapore. And there is one specific example that I'd like to bring up, which is called the Domestic Investment Strategic Fund, DISF. Dato' Hisham knows this well. An allocation was given, I think, about 200-300 million over a period of time. That's again administered by the Investment Promotion Agency in Malaysia called MIDA. And these were given out to a number of companies with the explicit purpose that they must invest in innovation that would be able to bring about multiplier effects for not just their company, but for the larger sector that they belong to. So if, let's say, access to that data could be given to, let's say, the World Bank and more or even MBA students here at ASB and other places, then you'll be able to do both a qualitative as well as a quantitative study on what were the lessons learned, whether the positive ones like the ISF money was given to VTROX to improve their visual inspection machines, also given to some companies in the service sector. But of course, there are also cases where the money may not have led to the kind of desired result. So this kind of lessons, should be highlighted and communicated to the larger public. It will also be important information for MITI as well. And then the last one would be with regards to supply chain resilience, right? I wasn't in government during the COVID period, but one of the biggest challenges that government faced, and I'm sure Dato' Hisham also had a sense of this when he was at MOT, was that during the COVID shutdown, you needed to get special permission letters that were issued by MITI if, let's say, you belong to an essential service sector, right? So essential service sector included logistics, included different parts of manufacturing where you manufactured for food and other necessities. But the government was not in a position to be able to evaluate the supportive or the supporting companies and their products that contributed to the essential sector. So for example, I make bread, right? I'm definitely a part of the essential sector. But how about the guy who makes the plastic that supplies me to wrap my bread, right? So he has to prove that he is my supplier. And then what about the people who supply other inputs to that person, right? I see King Tek there laughing because he was one of the people who was roped in by MITI to evaluate and to try to understand whether or not these companies were part and parcel of the critical supply chain. So that data is sitting somewhere in a server. This is under Mari, right? If let's say the data could be accessed and then cleaned up, what kind of how resilient would be some of these supply chains with regards to their connection to essential sectors, with their connection to FDI as well as DDI. And I think this would be very, very rich analysis that would be beneficial, not just to Malaysia, but I think from a global perspective as well.
Sir, these are, fantastic questions which have tremendous research potential and tremendous policy relevance. So it's really great examples.
Maybe one last point. It's very difficult, I think, for the civil service to really have this kind of collaborative exercise because the downside would be that some of these shortcomings are highlighted. Whereas the upside of the benefits may be, not so obvious. So, it may require some political cover. Maybe the minister can sign off, and then whatever blame happens, hopefully the minister will take the bullet for it or take responsibility for it, rather than to pass the responsibility to Dato' Hisham, which I'm sure he's had many sort of like these not so positive experiences in the past, which I'm well aware of. That's one of the challenges.
I think this data, I'll be honest with you, is a big challenge. We had a great meeting with Minister Mustafa also when he was cabinet minister in the EPU. And, it is a problem even for researchers here. Every institution, every university I've been to and think tank, I think it affects the quality of research and it affects the relevance of the research. So I think this is an ongoing agenda. My colleague Yasuhiko and Mei Ling have been engaging with the government. But I think the questions you identify, and we even wrote a note, which we'll share with you, please. Tobias is there, which is a note which showed the kinds of things, the kinds of policy questions we could ask and address if we had better access to data using a comparator country like Indonesia. So I would share that note with you again, because I think this has to be part of the conversation. But I'd like to give you all, you've been patient. I thought I would turn to you earlier, but I was tempted to ask all these provocative questions. So do you have maybe a few questions from all of you? Since we have these people here, we can keep them trapped for a little longer. Please.
Thank you, Aditya. I think private sector specialists will go back. I just have this. Thank you, Aditya. Yeah, just think private sector specialists will go back. Just very quick question is this FDI has been always a double-edged sword. Like it has given us technology, advanced management, and so on. But same time, when you talk to the SME, they say when they try to recruit the best engineers, the FDIs or guys always got the best guys. So SME cannot grow as a result of that. This is one of the problems going on. But my question is, how do we make smart use of FDIs going forward? Yeah, thank you.
Let's collect one or two other questions. Please be brave. Yeah.
I can talk from here. To President.
Let's hear you more clearly.
Thank you very much to President Wong. Let's play imaginative to have an idea of priority. So suppose that a genius of the lamp comes to you and say, President Wong, I want to help the Malaysian semiconductor industry to meet this 1.3 trillion target for 2030, and I grant you 3 wishes that overnight will happen in Malaysia. The only constraint is no lower taxes, no higher subsidies. What 3 things you pick?
Oh, you know,
Just to lay a question on that, I understand your thought process on developing global leaders in Malaysia. So when you look at the semiconductor industry, like advanced economies like US, they put the number of shortage in terms of skilled technicians and engineers to 90,000, 300,000. India, which is a limited production of getting into limited production of fabs, put it at like around 10,000 in the next few years. How big is the challenge of talent in terms of skills in Malaysia for the evolution of the industry?
Just one more question.
Yeah, just one question on the social aspect of like they are intergenerational workforce currently in the SME space, right? Like the family succession, like all the, I would say, large size SME, right, are owned by family. It's a component, right? It's like a social component. Like how like, let's say President Wong, you were saying, how can we move forward? We already know this, right? But there's a gap, like in a lot of like social factors, I think are not factoring in, especially currently is happening right now. Like the people who have resources, how they're gonna like this will link to the private sector question just now. Like how can they really make the decision to like hire data analysts, for example, in SME level? Like if they don't allocate the budget for that, the SME would not skill up because they don't see the need of like hiring this kind of like specific skilled people. That's why the Malaysian brain drain is happening and etc. So I would just like to hear your thoughts from the government, from the private sector, and from the education, like the future education group.
Thank you. So, I'm sorry how long you expected to be here, but this is a great conversation. So if you,
I think maybe we better decide on the time. Otherwise, we can talk for a long time.
let's talk for a little longer if you don't.
10 minutes? Okay, I'll take a few minutes.
Okay, let's agree. We'll have 10 minutes more. Is that okay? Is that reasonable? Yes.
Sure.
Thank you.
I'll just address the issue on the 3 wishes and the SME impact on SMEs. As I said earlier, our strategy has been FDIs, and and I also want to applaud the government for attracting valuable, high quality, strategic and high tech FDIs. Even though Malaysia did not get all the so-called global FDIs into Malaysia, but we actually did get the high quality ones. And it enhances the supply chain. Okay. So you can see that, for example, we got the AT&S, they are doing substrate. We don't have substrate manufacturing here. Now we have a global one. We have Simatech, which is another substrate manufacturing. And then you have Lam Research, we have doing fab equipment. And then they attracted a lot of other suppliers to strengthen the supply chain. So we have that. So that's very good. We should continue. But the issue here is that we attracted so many, and they need so many engineers, technicians, and so on. Where are we going to get them? All right. And if I just now projected that if you're going to double our output from 600 billion to 1.2 trillion over the next 7 years, where are all these talents going to come from? We already have 15 to 20% of our talent leaving the country. There's already a hole. So we need two kind of solution. One is a short term and one is a long term. The short term to help us right through the next 7, 8 years so that we can grow, okay? And what strategy has been working? If you look at US, you look at Singapore, you look at other countries, you know, they are using other countries' talent. US, in all their design, IC design, when I was in Intel, when they did the 386 microprocessor, 70% of engineers are from foreign countries. They're not Americans. But did they deprive Americans of a job, or they created more jobs? In fact, they created more jobs from 386 to go 486 and so on. And all the latest microprocessors, that journey started. We need to help our companies here to go that path and keep going because we're going to create more jobs. So you look at the data, you know, the average salary for Malaysian is about 3,000 plus, right? For the semiconductor industry or electronics industry, it's more than 6,000. If you go on this technology path, the wages will be higher. So the question is then, how do we go and support that growth? So we come back to the SME. Every time an investment comes in, SME is the one that loses out the most because they lose their engineers. The other companies, FDIs, are willing to pay 30 to 60% more for the salary. These guys cannot match. If it's 10%, maybe can do it. 20% maybe is a stretch. But after that, it cannot. Okay? They don't have the margin to do it because they are only, just now we talk about economy of scale. They don't have economy of scale because these guys are all global. Okay, I lose some here, I go and put down here. So they balance out. But so what are the SMEs going to do? So they need help. Where do I go to get the talent? So my only proposal to the government in terms of policy is use the same strategy that other countries are doing, like Singapore. We have Taiwan, we have everybody looking at our talent. They are all here looking at our talent, even including China, trying to hire our people. Use other countries' talent. We got to do it as a short-term measure. In fact, it's not a short-term measure forever. You just do it while we develop our own talents. And to do that, you know, if you look at our quality of education, still a long way to go. We have to get it up to the high level of international standard. You know, just like the PISA scores and so on. And the number of students studying science and engineering is dropping. So all these need to be arrested. These are all the policies that I think the government need to do to help at least the future and help our local SMEs. The war on talents is going to be strong, and we have to find a way to hold on to our people. I'll just leave it at that. Thank you. I forgot. Okay.
Thank you. So, I mean, FDIs has benefited us where we are today because of the FDI policy that we've had in the past. So some companies are very good. They make sure that the FDI that they invested here, they make sure that they realize them according to to what they have planned. But some companies sometimes there are changes in the plans, in their own supply chain, their own competition, in the global geopolitical changes, and they couldn't realize the full amount which we have already approved for them. So the question on how do we make FDIs better is currently is that we have formed now the National Investment Council, chaired by PM, and the next meeting is this 19th of May. And in this meeting, what we are going to do is that we are going to strengthen MIDA's uh, delivery management unit, where now we are going to follow up on every approved FDIs that we have received to make sure that it's realized according to what it has planned. And whenever there are problems that the company is facing, government will come in and intervene and make sure that we handhold the companies that and they realize to what they have already committed. So that's one way on how we want to make the FDIs better. Now, the other radical changes that we are going to be introducing very soon is how do we coordinate the 31 investment promotion authorities or agencies that we have in this country. So imagine you are an investor, you come to Malaysia and you have 31 investment promotion agencies, and how confusing it can become for investor. So now we are going to be rationalizing that, and hopefully on the 19th, the Prime Minister will be announcing something new on how do we rationalize this and how do we make the investment climate more easier for the investor now to understand, for them to plan, so that there will be certainty for them to now decide on whether to invest or not in Malaysia. And fourthly is that this high profile NIC or National Investment Council that is chaired by the PM is that we need fast decisions, and this council will make that fast decision so that we are competing for FDIs, and companies are always looking for the best in when they want to invest in the country. And when a company wants to invest in Malaysia, their eyes in Vietnam, they will look at, hey, this company is flying from Malaysia. We have to talk to them also. Indonesia will do to them. We'll do the same to these companies. So we must make sure that we catch them early and make sure that whatever that they require from us to facilitate their investment decision, we will fulfill them through this NIC. So this regulatory reform is also something that we'll be focusing on a lot more after this, because the name change in Ministry of Investment shows on the importance on now that we are focusing in terms of making sure that Malaysia continues to become the favorite or favorable investment hub in this region. Thank you.
Just one quick one on the issue of second generation, and I think it's a larger question of business transformation, not just to do with data and whatnot. And I would say I'm cautiously optimistic for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that with the second or third generation, usually these would be people of the business owners who have been exposed to a lot more recent developments, technology trends. Some of them are educated overseas, so they are more broad-minded. And they also have connections in other different parts, other industries. So the possibility for them to value add or up the game in terms of their own companies is actually much higher, including the possibility of hiring data scientists, at a competitive pay. That's one. Second is, I think many more companies, especially those in the service sector, are realizing that data is actually an asset that is underexploited. And with the advent of more professional management in these companies, those that manage to last, some of course don't, then they will be able to try to find ways to monetize those asset streams. So let me give an example. I have a friend who started his own company that's later since been sold off. They dominate the auto insurance processing market. So when you get into a car accident, you bring the car to the workshop. When the car workshop puts in all the applications to get back the claims and all that, it is through this particular company. And they sold that as a service. later on they realized that the data streams that they were getting with regards to where and when the accidents were taking place, in what, and also what period of time, what day of the month, what festival period and all that. Those are all data that could be monetized. And they hired and have been growing a data science team then. So that's another reason why I'm optimistic. And then the third reason is, even if, let's say, you do not develop those capabilities in-house, I think there's a lot of opportunities now for small private companies to offer very specialized data science services. So, for example, I know a friend who started a company called Urban Metry, providing very specific data analytics to do with the property sector, and they sell their services to property companies. So not all SMEs may want to do it in-house. They may employ the services of all these other companies, and this also can build up the data science ecosystem in Malaysia, and hopefully be able to create good jobs and prevent these data scientists from being forced to go to other countries. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We have strained the generosity of our guests. Mei-Ling, before you go, I wanted to first thank you, Dr. Wong, Dato Sri Wong, Dato Sri Isham, Dr. Ong, for a brilliant panel. I would also quickly like to thank our hosts at the Asian School of Business for their wonderful co-organizing and hospitality. My colleagues in the World Bank, especially Shafat Yar Khan, who led this whole event in collaboration with the country management and the staff of the Asian School of Business and the World Bank, who did an amazing job. The academics who've come from all over the region, all over the world, including from here. So you've made this a great conference, and this was the fitting finale. And I hope this is the beginning of a deep and meaningful relationship. I'm going to hand over to the country manager, Yasuhiko, for a final few words.
I was just texting the organizing team. That was the closing remark that I didn't have to give anymore. But that's Sri Sham, that's Sri Wong, Dr. Ong Kian Ming, and the colleagues, thank you very much. And also the colleagues from the Asian School of Business. It's been a very rich 2 days. I wasn't able to attend all of the sessions, but I did attend some of them. And if there's one topic that we're all concerned about and talking about, it's about this topic of the insecurity in the regional global economy and what's going on between China and US, and what's happening to the industries and so on. So that's the hot topic of the day. And I know you know this, but we have spent, for example, World Bank management spent hours discussing this over the last year or so. We don't know the answer, obviously, but it's a question that matters, and answers can make a difference. And it has the policy relevance and informing what people like Dato Sri Sham on a day-to-day basis do. So thank you very much for the collaboration. Some of that I think would require some translation. So just as much as Aditya doesn't know what FAB is, I didn't know what iceberg trade cost was. I looked it up, and now I know. So that the translation function and the World Bank hub here, which is dedicated to knowledge-based support for Malaysia, but also supporting the regional research agenda in the economic area by hosting Aditya's East Asian Pacific Chief Economist's Office, and more collaboration with all the academics in the country and the region and the rest on policy relevant topics like this would be very much welcome, and hopefully it will be informative for all the country stakeholders in the government, the private sector as well. So thank you again.